Hello, everyone. We are ready to get started. I want to thank all of you for joining today, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jennifer Morse. I am the Director of Customer Success here at MadCap Software. And I am so delighted to have Ferry Vermeulen, Director at INSTRKTIV, a company he founded which focuses on developing compliant and user-friendly documentation with content reuse and single sourcing in mind. Now, Ferry has offices in Germany, the Netherlands, and the US, and I'm just so delighted to have him here. Welcome, Ferry. Thanks so much for joining today. We're so happy to have you. So today's session is about best practices for following European Union and United States regulatory requirements for electronic and print-based documentation. And in this webinar, Ferry will review what information should be included in packaging and what content can be legally placed online to stay in compliance, ideally all while maintaining a single source of truth. And while some of you may be very new to some of these concepts of reuse and single sourcing, so I'm also going to provide a very quick overview of the benefits of authoring and managing this regulatory content within a modular topic-based approach, ensuring you have maximum content reuse of both web and print-based outputs. So as always, we have a lot to cover today. I do want to review two quick items of business before we begin. First of all, this information or this webinar, it's all going to be recorded. So if you have to leave early, not to worry. We will be sending out a link to everybody after it's done. There's also a question panel in the GoToWebinar console. So we will be getting to those at the end. Would encourage you, if you have any questions, drop them in there, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can in the hour that we have. Whatever we don't get to live, we'll follow up with a question and answer document for everyone. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump right in. And as I mentioned, some of you may be newer to some of these concepts. So I just want to review quickly, why would you even consider using a tool? I'm going to go ahead and turn off my webcam just to create a little bit extra bandwidth. Sorry, everybody. So why would you even consider using a solution like Flare, MadCap Flare, to manage all of this regulatory content? Well, there's 4 key reasons that people can use Flare and consider using it for their documentation. The first one is this idea, and I mentioned it earlier, of content reuse. Folks that are authoring this kind of regulatory content often have the same procedural or policy-based information strewn across lots of different manuals that they have to produce, and they're really tired of updating the same content across all of those different manuals whenever there's a change, particularly to the small little common bits that often live across all of these different manuals. So that's a big thing that we address, is allowing you to maximize reuse across all of these different deliverables you need to support. The other one is this notion of multi-channel publishing. If you think of the regulatory content that you create now, maybe they were always delivered as print-based PDF documents, which is fine, but maybe now you have a requirement to deliver that content in something that's more searchable and navigable online, maybe in some sort of a private knowledge base or something published to an intranet or an extranet location. Maybe it has to be viewable on a smaller screen size, like a tablet or a mobile device. So that's the other problem that Flare can solve. The content that you write and manage can be published to all of the different channels that you need to support, both print and online. Improved self-service. When we produce searchable and findable content for our readers, you empower your end users to find what they need very quickly. And when we get out of a print-only world, not that there's anything wrong with the print-only world, that's certainly still a requirement and still doable. However, when we can get into an online deliverable as well, then we can start gathering data. We can start understanding, what are people searching for, what's important to them, what are they searching for that they can't find? How can we improve and augment this body of knowledge that we're maintaining based on how people use it every day? And then the last thing, if we combine all these things together, what we're also trying to do here is trying to keep it as flexible and easy to use as possible, so that if you are needing to create this kind of regulatory information, you do not have to be an XML programmer in order to achieve all of this reuse. Now, in terms of that very first content reuse bullet that I mentioned, I want to do a quick comparison for those of you who have not used this type of tool chain before. With something familiar. I'm using Microsoft Word here because it's ubiquitous. A lot of content starts in Microsoft Word, but this could be a lot of things. This could be a Google Doc. This could be PowerPoint. It could be a lot of different applications. But I'm going to start with Word since it's familiar. The challenge with using something like Word for content development and management is that what makes it so easy for us to use are all the things that get in the way of that content reuse concept that I mentioned. Because when you're working in something like Word, you're doing 3 things at once. You're not even thinking about it though, because it's become second nature. But what's happening in something like Word is you're authoring all of your content for one. You're sort of embedding the formatting. What is everything looking like? My headings, my paragraphs, the spacing between things. And the third thing that you're doing is you're defining the overall scope of the document. What do I mean by scope? Well, if I'm writing a draft a regulation manual for the EU for something, it's always a regulation manual for the EU for that one thing. If it's for the US, it's always for the US. So essentially what that document is gets baked right into it. And we really don't have a good way of reusing information. So if I start by writing this draft regulation manual, I may send it around to the team. Team says, Jen, that looks great. I need you to make one for the EU, okay, and maybe one specifically for Great Britain. Okay, so yes, there's going to be some similarities between them, but there are going to be differences. Each of these areas obviously has different regulations depending on what we're authoring. So in Word, I don't really have a way of reusing anything. I have to do this save as exercise. And now I've got 2 copies that stemmed from that source, and you can probably deal with 2, but you still got to go into both of those 2 to make changes perhaps to common text that does live between the both of them. So again, 2 is not a big deal, but in the real world, it often replicates more than just 2. What if we need to make a version for the US specifically, Canada, Japan, Australia? Every time we need a new unique deliverable, we have to do that save as exercise and create a new copy. And this is a very inefficient way to work. If we distill down to what's happening here, if we operate over here on the right-hand side of the screen, what we're doing is we're always hand touching and hand editing those end deliverables. And that's what sticks us in an inefficient way to work. The whole idea of using something like MadCap Flare for this content, and really just content management in general, we want to operate over here on the left-hand side of the screen, where if we have a policy, it only exists once. It may look different depending on the region for which we're publishing or who's going to use it. But if we need to make an update to that policy, we only want to do it in one place. We want our software to take care of the heavy lifting. How do we do it? Well, those 3 components that I spoke about in the Word document, how we're writing everything, we're embedding that formatting, and we're defining the scope. When you manage this content in Flare, we do it a little bit differently. We break those things into separate components. Let me just start with the authoring piece first, since there's a few things we do differently when we approach the writing of this information in Flare. So Word, more linear, start at the beginning, we write into the end. In Flare, we follow a concept known as topic-based authoring. So you may have heard this concept before, but in Flare, we're going to think about topics. If you think of maybe a long policy manual that you've read in the past, maybe it's made up of multiple chapters. Well, if we just look at one of those chapters, maybe chapter 4 is made up of some procedures and some reference sections. And that's the kind of granularity we're going to think about with Flare. We're going to take those 2 procedures and those 2 reference sections that make up the entirety of chapter 4. We're going to break those out as standalone files. And in Flare, those files are called topics. There's not a rule that says topics can be this long or it can be this short. Generally speaking, though, topics should have some identifiable purpose. They should have some specific subject, and they should be able to stand on their own. So it may just be, a heading called scope and just a paragraph. Well, if that makes sense on its own, that's fine. It doesn't have to be, there's no rule about the length of it, but it shouldn't be so short where it doesn't make sense. And it wouldn't be able to be reused somewhere else. So in my picture here, if I need to produce some unique PDF regulatory manual for a particular region, maybe it needs these highlighted topics. So in Flare, I'm going to grab these topics, I'm going to stitch them together in a particular order that I need, and I'm going to produce a unique PDF regulatory document for that region. At the same time, I may need to produce a slightly different version of that PDF for a different country. Maybe it includes these topics. I'll grab them together, stitch them together, perhaps in a slightly different order, and produce another unique document. And so often when we move from that linear approach, like in Word, where we start at the beginning and we write until the end, when we approach it this way, it often solves a lot of problems for a lot of people. But sometimes you have to go to another level. Maybe as an example, this compliance topic, which was highlighted in both of these sort of fictitious PDFs I've just been talking about, maybe this compliance topic, there's some information in there that doesn't apply to one of the deliverables we need to produce. Maybe there's a step in there or some words in there that we don't need for the EU or the US or whatever. And so what we can do is we can keep compliance as a single topic, but we can customize it with various single sourcing techniques so that we only have to go to compliance once. We don't have to do a save as exercise and change it for the EU or the US or Canada. We can keep it as a single procedure or a policy and customize it. And we do that with another concept called single source publishing. Again, another fancy industry term that perhaps you've heard. But what it means is if you've got a version of your content for audience A and a special version of it for audience B and an entirely different variation for audience C, you're not going to have 3 versions to maintain. You can put all of that content in a single document and you can let your software do the heavy lifting. So what does it look like in terms of the Flare workflow versus Word? Well, in Flare, what we would do is start by creating our sort of global set of source files. Okay, so here I have a picture. Let's say this is the policy that we're authoring, and I may need to produce a few different versions of this policy depending on the country for whom we're publishing. So maybe we need to produce this in HTML5 and PDF, but it needs to look a little bit different. I'm not going to save as and copy it. I'm going to author it, create my master set of source files here, and I'm going to customize it in Flare by using some single sourcing techniques, like using things called conditional tags and variables. So as an example, that first paragraph here, maybe that is the first opening paragraph I want the US audience to see when they open this information. So I'm going to give it a special color code in Flare that says this information is special. This only applies to the US. This next paragraph, well, maybe this is specific to the EU, so I'm going to give it a different color code to let me know that it's special. Those next 2 paragraphs, those are the same for everybody. We're going to leave them alone. But this last paragraph down here, I want this to show up when I produce a PDF output for my US audience. So if content is unique for any reason at all in our source material, we can use one of these color codes, which we call conditional tags, to identify it. So it's great for us as authors because we know something special going on, but we can't deliver it to our end users looking this way. One thing I want to point out is these topics that we're authoring, these are raw, neutral XML files. They're not PDF specific, they're not HTML specific, they're nothing until we run them through a transform. And I always call this the XML alphabet soup. There's all these XML transforms out there that oftentimes, depending on the tool you're using, you have to hire developers to write them and program them and customize them. Well, our customers and our users, they don't care about the XML alphabet soup. They want it to be easy. So we put the XML transforms in Flare for you. We call them publishing targets. It's just a recipe that says, Flare, process these raw neutral files so the output looks the way we want for the audience that we want. So I may create an output for my US audience. It's going to be HTML5. I'm going to tell it, include those US bits, exclude anything marked as EU and PDF. I don't want it in there. I may create another one for my EU deliverable. It's going to include the EU content. I'm going to say get rid of anything marked as US and PDF specific. I do not want it in there. And then I also have to create that PDF file for my US audience. So it's going to include the PDF specific content, the US specific content, but I can get rid of all of that EU stuff. So if I need a new deliverable, if my content's written, I don't have to duplicate anything. I just create a new publishing target and it just becomes this sort of publish on demand kind of experience. And then from there, I can build my outputs for the different deliverables. So the US audience online, they're only going to see those red bits there. The EU, they're only going to see their blue bits and of course the common paragraphs, and then that PDF specific output that includes the US and the PDF specific content only. Those colors don't show up on our output. I only put them there to show the flow of care. The last slide I want to cover before I turn it over to Ferry to get into the meat of this, and once we've covered the concepts, is if we were to zoom out a little bit, just in terms of that's big picture, but it's often when we work in Flare versus Word, it's often 3 steps. We do give you the ability to import existing information. So if you're going to be repurposing content and managing it now as a single source, we have Flare has a number of importers for existing content, as you can see. Probably the most popular is Word and HTML files. We can bring in data content as well. Once everything's imported, well, then we can edit that information, make it look the way we want. All of the content in Flare, that look and feel element is completely separated. We don't embed any of that. So it's very easy to edit the look and feel of our content at will. We can create new topics and content, of course, within the Flare editor. And then from there, we can publish. So once everything's edited and looking the way we want, I'm not going to go through all of these. Probably the most popular deliverables for this kind of content is going to be direct to PDF and responsive HTML5 for the online delivery. So that's some of the high-level concepts that I wanted to cover in terms of a single sourcing workflow and content reuse. But Ferry, I am going to turn everything over to you so we can learn all about this great content that you're going to share with us. And again, I just want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. So I'll go ahead and turn everything over to you. And when you're ready, you can go ahead and share your screen.
There we go. Thank you, Jen. What a brilliant introduction. Almost have nothing to add anymore. Now, we're going to talk indeed about differences between the European Union and the US regarding content, but also regarding the medium. So what does the legislation in the US and in the EU tell us about the medium in which the information for use documentation needs to be presented? Because I think it's one of the, in my experience, is one of the the often heard questions. So companies more and more are looking for ways to reduce the environmental impact of their user instructions. But they also want to save on printing costs, of course, and especially when you're selling electrical equipment to, well, worldwide or to maybe 24 countries within the European Union. It can sum up. So a printed manual quite often contains like 100, maybe a couple of 100 pages. So you can really make an impact here if you know what to do. At the same time, the topic on determining whether to publish parts online or determine what must be included in the packaging is quite complex. So what I hope to tell you here during this webinar is, well, I hope to give you some insights in how the legislation works in the European Union and in the US, and how you can sort out yourself what to do to make some decisions. So let's start. And first of all, there's a chat function in the GoToMeeting window, and I'm quite curious. Can you please tell me if you're selling your products within the European Union or in the US, or maybe both or other markets? So I'm quite interested in who's attending this webinar. So I'll give you a few seconds. Thanks for that. So what is my goal for this webinar? First of all, I want you to inform about the European Union and United States product safety legislation. There are differences, but there are also a lot of similarities. I want to teach you how you can determine what can be published online. I want to help you to decide how you can save money on printing costs, and above all, I want you to know how you can avoid legal pitfalls. And there's one thing that I want to get out of this webinar myself, and that is that you understand that the best way to save costs and avoid legal pitfalls is through using the system that I'll discuss. So the system is more or less a summary of the steps that we follow internally on how to determine what you can publish online. And besides that, I want you to know that, and Jen already took told us that how you can use a content management system to create both electronic and print-based documentation, and as well how you can make sure that you include the right parts for the right market. So yeah, to create documentation like this, on the left you see an example of output that we created with Flair and some PDF user guide. So quite often it's not clear to companies what and when to use print output or online output. And I'm not going to wait any longer, so I'm not going to ask you to to stay till the end. You definitely should do, but let's jump right away into the meaty details. So the system to determine what you can publish online and what you can provide printed, I've called it the POD system, print or online determination. For the EU, consists of these 10 steps, and you can, it will be recorded, this webinar, so you can always go back to the beginning. This is the system for the EU. We're going to discuss it into more detail, so we'll get to that. And this is the system for the US. So the US looks a little bit easier, but yeah, no, actually that's right, because the European Union has more things to consider. So who am I? I'm raised in a machinery factory. I have a background in industrial engineering, a director of INSTRKTIV. So we've created over, I think, almost 2,500 user manuals over the past few years. Two things, if you're interested. So the blog that I have is quite well visited. So I tend to post on topics like usability and documentation, on a lot about legislation. So subscribe to the newsletter, follow the YouTube channel, and I run a podcast on these topics. So let's jump in. I want to kick off with the European Union. As I said, the requirements, not per se the requirements, but things to consider in the EU are, the list is a bit longer. So what I'm going to present is a lot of information, and I've put in a lot of complete sentences, so with some links, so you can always visit certain websites of the European Union, etc. yourself. But as the topic is so complex, I can't stick to each slide too long. So sometimes I might jump quite soon to the next slide, but yeah, just be aware of that. And we got a email from one of the attendees right now, and he asked, okay, so the presentation will be about the European Union and the US, but what about Brexit? So I wanted to include this note, and so everything what I'm discussing here in this webinar at this moment, it still applies for Great Britain, as all the rules are still harmonized at the moment. Not harmonized is not the correct word, but they are the same until the EU or the UK changes its rules. And please always take notice of that. So at the moment is when you make a decision, check if everything changes. For example, 26th of May, the medical device regulation will come into force in the European Union, and that may affect compliance with the UK as well. So I did a quick research on that. So when you want to have more information on this topic, then you can go to the website of for example, to gov.uk, which is the website of the United Kingdom, and there is information about UKCA, which is the equivalent of CE marking, and yeah, what it will mean. So that's about Brexit. Then the legislation landscape in Europe consists of regulations, directives, and one more. Regulations, directives, and decisions. Sorry, I forgot to add it there. So that those three are three kinds of legislation, and there are differences between them. But when it comes to product safety, you mostly see regulations and directives. For example, there is the medical device regulation, which will come into force this year, and there is the machinery directive, which applies to machinery. Other ones are EMC directives, low voltage directives for all different other kinds of products. So that's being determined by the European Commission. So they draw up this legislation. And then there are standards. As you can imagine, the machinery directive, for example, it does apply to all kinds of machinery, and it's almost impossible to create one law that applies to all kinds of machinery. So in order to comply with the requirements from a machinery directive, for example, which is quite general, it contains general requirements on the safety of machinery, but also on safeguarding the technical file, the user instructions, etc. So in order to comply with those requirements, standards are being developed, and standards tell you much more, tell more specifically how you can comply with one of the requirements of the machinery directive. And a big difference between the US and the EU is that standards in the EU actually always are voluntary, where in the US there are both mandatory standards and voluntary standards. Although they are voluntary in the European Union, you always have to have, well, quite really good reasons not to apply a standard. So it's always best to use a standard when you develop and market your product, but it's not absolutely mandatory. When you do apply standards to create, for example, medical device or machinery or a hammer or an electric angle grinder, then you create the highest presumption of conformity with the directives and regulations, meaning when something does happen with your product, or as someone gets killed, for example, and the market authorities knock on your door, the first thing they will do is ask for the Declaration of Conformity, which states that you declare as the manufacturer that your product complies with the legal requirements, and it also states which standards you have applied. And when you mention standards there, you have created the highest presumption of conformity. So this is the website of the European Commission. I always advise to go to this exact website, because this is the single source of truth, where you can find everything about European legislation. For example, here you find an overview of all the product groups that are regulated, and it's a combination of CE marking products and non-CE marking products. Won't dive in too much detail about that, but for example, on the section Consumers and Workers Protection, toys are regulated, and PPE, which is quite a hot topic in this COVID period, but also electric and electronic products are regulated. So the most or quite important ones are the low voltage directive for product over 50 volts, radio equipment for everything that has like a Wi-Fi module or Bluetooth, and the EMC directive, healthcare, and European legislation is being set out in these two laws, decision, regulations, and actually they say how European legislation is organized. It provides a framework, and under those, part of that framework are all individual regulations and directives. So they give requirements on the EMC directive, for example, on the electromagnetic compatibility of electronic products. The machinery directive gives requirements on design requirements on the machine, but also on the documentation, like I said. And what you see at the right of this slide is a requirement regarding the translations, and each directive or regulation is quite specific about translation. So instructions should always be translated to the market where you sell the products. And why am I saying this? Because this text is taken from the EMC directive. Here you see the low voltage directive, machinery directive, etc. They all require to translate your user instructions. Why is this in there? Because the directive and decision from a few slides earlier, they mentioned this as well, because they determined this framework. They're at the basis of this framework. Because it's determined there, all individual directives mention this requirement as well. This is different when it comes to print and online distribution, because when you study on all those directives, and I think there are like over 25 CE directives and regulations, you won't find any requirements on the medium, on whether to provide it print or online. So it doesn't matter if you have a low voltage device at your right hand side, if you have a machinery, a 3D print in the middle, or a medical device, you won't find any requirements on the medium. But there's more. So where directives and regulations are absolutely mandatory, you have to follow, you have to comply with those requirements. The European Union has developed guides on how to apply a certain directive or regulation. And although those guides are not legally binding, it can be, well, they give additional information on how to do things in the best way possible. And in order to determine if your instructions can be provided online or have to be printed, always apply, study those guides on application of a certain directive. So for example, there is a guide to application of the EMC directive, there's a guide to application of the machinery directive, etc. Most of them don't give any requirements. The radio equipment directive, so the third one, gives some requirements on the Declaration of Conformity. The machinery directive says that all health and safety, and now it becomes interesting, health and safety instructions must be supplied in paper form. And for the rest, actually, there you can't find anything about the medium in those guides neither. So medical device regulation is still being developed, those guides, by the way. So, but that's the next, and actually this is of the process of the system that I presented at the beginning. This is the second step. So always study, just make sure that you check those guides as well. Know that they exist. Another important document when it comes to European legislation is the Blue Guide. And the Blue Guide is, well, so to say, the Bible of European product safety legislation. And when you press Ctrl F in the Blue Guide and search for, I think it's for search on paper, then you'll find in a footnote number 100, you find this piece of text. Unless otherwise specified in specific legislation, whilst the safety information needs to be provided on paper, it is not required that all the set of instructions is also provided on paper. However, paper version should always be available. So again, as the machinery directive does, the Blue Guide, which covers all directives, all kinds of products, says that safety information needs to be provided on paper. Again, also the Blue Guide is it doesn't have any binding force, so it's not absolutely mandatory to follow what the Blue Guide says. It has a guidance purpose as well. So yeah, this is part of the guides as well, I would say. So I think this is step 3 of the system. Then the next thing you need to consider to make your decision is what your vertical standards say. And a vertical standard I'm not sure if it's an official term actually, but it applies to a particular industry or a particular a process, product, machinery, etc. So there is one for circular saws, there is one for MRI scans, there is one for lawn mowers, for example. Almost each product has its own vertical standard. For machinery, they are called B standards. As far as I know, and we've created quite a few user guides, I've never seen a vertical standard that has specific requirements on the medium. There's one standard for the 2607 that does say something about the medium, so print or online. We'll discuss that later. But at this moment, and with all kind of products for which we develop user instructions, there are not too many. There are no requirements on the medium, but always make sure that you check the vertical standard. So you can find them on the same website of the European Union that for which I provided the link in the beginning. When you go to that website and click on a certain product group, for example, machinery, scroll down, and there are mostly like 3 links to the harmonized standards, and there you can search for all standards that are harmonized under a specific directive. Feel free to send an email if that's not clear, because it's an important step. So yeah, this is the one that came into force last year. So it's the 2607, a specific user guide for instruction handbooks for machinery. It's considered as an addition to the 82079 standard for information for use, which is part of the European harmonization network, standardization network as well. And this standard, so applies to instruction handbooks specifically for machinery, says that in section 7, so that's the last bullet, it says that the format must be provided as agreed with the customer, taking local legislation of the country into account. So meaning, if there is no country-specific legislation, you're more or less free to do with it what you want, but we'll come to country-specific legislation in a bit. So besides the vertical standards which apply to specific products, product groups, there are horizontal standards, and as the name suggests, a horizontal standard applies to a broad range of products. This 8079 standard has been replaced last year by, so this is the standard from 2012, and the new one came into force in 2019, has been translated in 2020. But to show you where, well, how things change in standards. So the old one said in most cases a printed version of the instructions for use is necessary. In the new one, it says information for use should be based on the needs of the target audience. So just want to repeat, I'm giving a lot of information right now, and we'll all boil it down to the process later. But I think it's important to have, yes, some kind of background, so you know that the topic is quite complex. However, it's still considered to be important that the media allows easy access, etc., etc. But it should be based on the need of the target audience, and then you can have a discussion on, yeah, what's my target audience's need. So do they need an online manual, for example? So yeah, it becomes a bit subjective, I would say. So, but it's my opinion that, for example, when you work in a laboratory and it's quite dark, then your user, your target audience, may need they don't want to consult a paper manual. They need something that is It's in a user guide that has an electronic, comes in an electronic format. And this is actually from a real world example. So we conducted a little research for the Dutch railways, where they wanted to switch from paper documentation, which was all like on big shelves in the trains. They wanted to switch to electronic documentation. But for example, when a train gets stuck in a tunnel and there's no internet, then you are limited in the medium. So you can't have like videos that need an internet connection, for example. When you work in a clean room, paper is not allowed, so then your target audience has a different need. Or when you work in a greenhouse, paper gets wet, so your target audience has a different need. But yeah, when it comes to electronic equipment, yeah, does the user really need need an electronic user manual? So personally, I don't think so. So you can always, as a customer, you can always say, well, I don't need, I need a printed user guide. So then the requirement from this 8079 standard doesn't make any sense anymore. So just in a few cases, this change on the medium, the change of the requirements on the medium, to just have some effect to a small extent of products out there. Then we get to the requirements on the national requirements on the medium, because although almost everything is regulated on a European level, as we saw with when it comes to translations, the framework already says that user instructions must be translated. This means that it is law, European law, but as it's not stated in the directives, decisions, or regulations, that how and in what format the user instructions have to be provided, each single member state of the European Union still is allowed to have its own requirements on the medium. And for example, Belgium, so I think I've, at this moment, I've had the answers of all member states, what their requirements are on the medium. And for example, Belgium says we can't assume that all users in Belgium have access to the internet. In other words, Belgium market surveillance authorities will maybe checking the product and the instructions, and when they don't find a printed instruction, they you may get a fine, or the product needs to be taken off the market, or you have to do a recall and add user instructions. So each single member state has its own vision, and then quite a few stick to the blue guide, for example. So they say safety instructions need to be provided in print, but some just say no, the user manual needs to be provided in print. Then I think we discussed everything from a product safety perspective right now for the European Union. And there is one other important thing to talk about, and that's product liability. So in Europe, product liability is organized differently from the US. In Europe, there is a product liability directive, and this directive holds the producer liable for damage caused by a defect in the product. And due to case laws in Europe, it has become clear that a defective product also includes a defective user manual. So and there are some examples from daily practice. When a judge may decide that some kind of, like an accident could have been prevented because when adequate or printed user instructions were given, then you may be held liable for that defect. So take that into account. So to summarize, some takeaways for the European Union. There are language requirements, so instructions have to be translated. There are no online or print requirements by the directives. Each directive or regulation has specific requirements on the content, so we didn't talk too much about that, but each directive says, for example, the radio equipment directive says that the frequency bandwidth has to be included, that the intended use, description of the intended use needs to be included. The machinery directive has section 1.7.4.2 with like a massive list with all kinds of requirements on the instructions. Some guides say that safety information should be printed. Then we discussed the 2607 and the 8079, and we know right now that the member states have different laws. So that's how it's organized in the EU. Story for the US will be a bit quicker. Legislation is named differently. So in the US, there are federal laws, there are acts, which is an individual law, and there are regulations that are made by departments and agencies. And in the US, there are both mandatory and voluntary standards, which can be found on the websites of each individual agency or department. So here you see, just as a comparison with what I've shown you on the website of the European Union, this is, well, more or less an overview of agencies and departments and regulated product groups in the US. And you can find this overview, well, I took it from the website of the CPSC, which regulates consumer products in the US. So that's why you don't find consumer products within this overview, but you do find medical devices. You do find the OSHA, which regulates machinery and working environments, etc. Then there is, so the screenshot was taken from the website of the CPSC, which stands for the Consumer Product Safety Commission. The CPSC was established in, I think, was 1972, when the Consumer Product Safety Act came into force. And in 2008, the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act came into force. So those two are closely related to each other. And the purpose of the CPSC and the Act is to protect the public against unreasonable risks of injuries and deaths associated with consumer product. And this is the goal of the CPSC, and each other agency, such as the FDA or OSHA, has its own purpose, of course. Those agencies create regulations. For example, the FDA has its own code of federal regulations, for example, for medical devices, and the OSHA has so for machinery, for example. This is taken from the website of the FDA and is the portal to labeling requirements, meaning everything that is being marked on the product and is being provided in the form of user instructions with the product. This is one of those Code of Federal Regulations. And so each agency determines how you need to comply with a certain product or product group. So in order to comply, they determine a set of mandatory standards, but they also list in most cases sets of voluntary standards. And in order to determine what is mandatory, for example, you have to go to the website of the federal agency, and it's not cpsc.gov, so the link is a bit longer. So I hope this works in when you watch the webinar in replay. If not, just ask me for the link. But yeah, go to the website of the federal agency, and there you can navigate to the overview mandatory standards, and there you find the overview of everything that's mandatory for all product groups. And then you can go, for example, for toys, click on the link, and then you see exactly what is mandatory for that product group. You can do exactly the same for voluntary standards. And when it comes to product liability, I already mentioned that it's organized a bit differently in the US, so there is no strict product liability regulation. However, some states have some form of consumer protective statute, and more important than in the EU, liability is often determined in the form of case law. And because of those case laws, we know that there also in the US, there's a duty to warn when a product is dangerous. And in the past, it has been determined that products may be deemed defective on the basis of a warning defect. So failing, when you fail to properly warn, then this will set a warning defect, and typical warning defects are inadequate warnings. So as a manufacturer, you will be held liable under a strict product liability claim. So when something happens and you're being brought to court, then you may be held liable for having a warning defect. And well, quite important actually, it still is quite hard to determine how far the duty to warn extends. And as a manufacturer, it's always your responsibility to determine this. Meaning, when you're going to determine if you want to provide your instructions online or in print, you always have to take your liability into account and the safety of your audience. Because there's always a risk, and if in court is being decided that you didn't do everything to prevent the accident that happened, for example, then you may be held liable. So as far as we know, at this moment, print online is not regulated in the US. However, there is a duty to warn against dangerous products, meaning that if you provide inadequate warnings, you will be held liable as a manufacturer. So we have a few minutes left. Let's go to any legal possibilities. So again, here are, well, this is the combined system. So first of all, you, in order to determine what to provide online or print, you have to determine in the European Union at least what the big savers are. With big savers, I mean, do you have machinery? So does the 2607 apply, and are there any agreements with your customer, or do you have, does your target audience have a specific need? For example, do you sell machinery for in greenhouses or in labs? Then you have to decide what federal requirements are, or European requirements on the union level in the EU. For the European Union, check the requirements of the guides, check the requirements of the standards. Always check any national requirements in the EU or any state requirements. California, for example, has, when it comes to content of user instructions, they do have some stricter requirements than other states in the US. Also, always check quickly when you work or have to work with a test institute or a notified body, what their requirements are. For example, TÜV in Germany, it can be a UL in the US, FCC. So it could be that they require a printed manual for testing purposes. Always verify the requirements on the content. So check those acts, laws, regulations, standards, etc., because they also mostly give requirements on the content. And when you did your research, then create your vision. So it's always deciding what to provide in print or online is always a company decision, a management decision based on the research that you did. So I hope that I did provide some proper guidelines here, so you know where you can find this information, but in the end, it's always a company decision. And so we've discussed now where you can find this information. These are all legal requirements or semi-legal requirements, as in not everything is absolutely legally binding. So when you look strict into the regulations and laws, you can do this, create this, have this vision, create this vision about the medium. But in step 9, and we want to emphasize that in, I think, the next slide. No, not yet, but there may be other pitfalls to take into account. So it's not only a matter of complying with requirements or legislative requirements. So yeah, just quite often there are some possibilities to save on printing costs when you create a quick start guide, but I would always advise to call it the manual, includes the safety instructions with the product and the full manual with all add-on information online. And actually Belgium says that quite well. A simplified manual with an electronic link to a more complete manual may be accepted. So this is where for many companies the direction will be. And for the US, it's similar. So a quick start guide with warnings and safety information may cover it. Always make sure to check what requirements are on the content, of course, as we discussed. And full manual can be placed online. Again, this is an opinion. This is for like very general for many product groups, but always do a proper research based on your specific situation. And consider these legal pitfalls. So always, when you make your decision, think, what is, did I take the safety of my user into account? Related to that, always consider yourself, okay, what is the risk on my company's liability? Next, is there any risk from a market authority perspective? So will I get a fine or recall if I do not comply? Because there are still companies that don't comply. Apple, for example, quite often doesn't provide anything, but they have the power to negotiate with market authorities. Check your test institute, which we discussed that. Consider the perspective from a customs point of view. So when you import into the European Union, customs may check your product and the user instructions. So there may be some risk as well when there is not a proper user manual there. And that's why, well, now, not going to talk about that. Yeah, is it logistically feasible? Meaning within the European Union, do you want to determine for each member state if what needs to be provided online or printed, or is it easier just to yeah, put a little bit more on print? So when you have taken this into account, you can create awesome user manuals like we do for these clients. You can use single source solutions like MadCap Flare to single source content, create your safety instructions for print, create online output, create instructions for different markets, for the US with an FCC statement, for example, for the EU with your Declaration of Conformity included, for example. And yes, some bonus paper savers as a bonus. So if you still want to maximize the amount of paper that you want to save, you can always think of how you structure your manual. So maybe you want to reuse illustrations only once in the beginning. You want to reduce the amount of white space that you use. You want to reuse content throughout your user guides. Single sourcing is the answer again. Or you want to make sure that your font size meets the requirements of the 82079 standard, which says continuous text, and you can find it at the bottom, needs to be 10 points. So we've come at the end of this presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ferry. We do have some questions that have come in. I know we're right at the top of the hour. I'll just ask if everybody could stay on for just a minute. I do want to just review two things before we get to some questions here. We may not get to them all, but keep them coming. I just want to remind everybody, you may have received some correspondence about this, but if you are new to MadCap Flare and you're interested in testing it and subscribing to it, if you end up purchasing a 24 or 36-month subscription, then we will provide MadCap Central free for 6 months. We didn't have time to talk about that today, but it's a cloud-based content management system that works with Flare. So please contact sales or drop us a line at sales@madcapsoftware.com if you have any questions about this promotion. And also, if you're an existing Flare customer and you want to subscribe to Central, well, then you will get 15 months for the price of 12. So some nice promotions there if you're looking to either acquire the solutions or perhaps add on to what you have. Okay. Couple minutes here for some questions. I just want to read it. This was a great one that's come in, and we didn't talk about this, so I wanted to repeat this for everyone since it sort of bubbled up. A couple of folks asked a similar question, Ferry, but for translation, is machine translation like Google Translate acceptable? I thought this was a really good question given this information you've provided today.
Is it acceptable? Well, the technique gets better and better. So it may be acceptable when the translations are okay, but I think always some post editing will be, well, as far as I know, some post editing will be required, as you need some humans to check if, and especially safety information, has been translated correctly.
Correct. And so to kind of build on that, another good question that came in, kind of piggybacking on that concept. When localizing guides for EU, does the content need to match the original, or can you just provide a streamlined localized version?
Can you repeat that question, Jen?
Sure. When localizing guides for EU, does the content need to match the original, or can you just provide a streamlined localized version?
And then you mean that when you have an original version, for example, for the German market, can you create a simplified one for other European markets, or when you have like a US version, can you create a simplified version for other markets?
Maybe the person who posted the question can clarify, but I suspect perhaps.
I think it will be, for example, let's say we're a German company and we have a full user manual in German. Do we need to translate the full manual to all of the languages of the other member states? So you may not. But it's important to, for each member state, the same content requirements need to be taken into account. So when your German manual contains more information than is required, so yes, then you may want to create a simplified one in order to save some paper, for example. Mm-hmm. So we've been talking a lot about the legal requirements, but just don't forget your user. So of course, saving paper, etc., may have some benefits as reduce the environmental impact, etc. But the user also needs to be served and needs to master the product. So the more you are trying to reduce, maybe the less happier your user becomes.
Yeah, that's a good point. A couple other ones I want to bring. I thought this was a great question too.
Sorry, can I add one more thing to the translation question?
Yes.
Team translation, I would be careful with that, because when you dive into, for example, the 82079 standard, there are definitely requirements on the translation process in those standards, and there are also specific standards on translation in general. And I don't have the exact wording here right now, but it definitely says something that translations need to be done by competent persons, so which would exclude machine translation. But when you would post edit the machine translation, then you will be on the safe side again.
Right. I wanted to pose this one too. I thought this was a great question. When you write instructions, is there any sort of organization that you can submit them to so that they are checked for compliance?
No, but we we do compliance checks every now and then. So we get questions, for example, to check use instructions if they comply with European requirements, and for example, if they comply with the 82079 standard on information for use. But again, be really careful, because it's not allowed to claim compliance on the 82079 standard. It's allowed to claim compliance on certain sections of the standard, but you can't um, um, claim full compliance on the standard. A standard, it's a horizontal standard that applies to many products. So checking on compliance, yes, on the requirements of the directives and regulations, that's absolutely possible. But compliance on standards, we can give, or other companies can give, advice on how to optimize your user instructions so it becomes a better user instructions that comes closer to the requirements of the standard.
Great. Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one or two more. Here's a good question. When most of the EU directives are quite expensive to purchase, especially when I'm just trying to find out whether or not the directive even applies, or when I just want to read for personal study. Do you have any suggestions on how to get directives at an affordable price?
Well, yeah. First of all, the directives are freely available. So from the link that is at the beginning of my presentation, so the ec.europe. You can download all directives and regulations for free. Standards, you have to pay for standards on the other hand. So standards are always can be quite expensive. So I think the person that asks the question means standards. I have one tip on purchasing standards. What we always do is we go to the website of the Estonian Standardization Institute, the EVS, I think. Yeah, you can find it, and as far as I know, their prices are far more reasonable, as in 10 times more affordable.
Right. Good. Thanks for the tip. Okay, I think we have time for one more, Ferry. Thanks so much. Hang on, guys. What should be the minimum content of a QSG?
Well, the term quickstart guide, QSG, officially does not exist in the European Union, for example, and it also does not exist in the US. So actually, you can't say what are the minimum requirements on the quickstart guide. What you can say is what are the minimum requirements on the user manual, and we've talked about that. So when you determine those minimal requirements and put everything, all the rest online, and you call that document with the minimum requirements the quickstart guide, yeah, then that's the way to go. And for example, where you can, so often companies are looking for possibilities to save. So mostly they say, okay, we want to provide a quickstart guide instead of a full manual, but actually a quickstart guide still is a simplified version which only contains the required content. And where we see you can save the most is when you have, for example, meta products, products that are hardware products and with software combined. And quite often software is not safety related, and it is often a huge part of a user manual. And you may want to decide that you place all that information online. You can also create a quickstart guide, maybe with 1, 2, 3 installation steps of the product for a simple electronic device. Put the name of the manufacturer, description of the intended use, if it's not already in the name of the product. For example, hair dryer, it already says what the intended use is, and intended use is a legal requirement for many products. And in that case, you create your own quickstart guide. And yeah, so I think that answers the question.
Great. And just a quick tip from another, just to kind of tag on to what you mentioned in terms of the tip about the pricing on the standards is and thank you to the attendee who suggested this, but you can get a discount on standards for memberships such as ISTC or STC. So wanted to point that out. So the Society for Technical Communication, or I believe, I'm trying to remember what the I is, at the International Standard for Technical Communicators. I'm trying to remember what the I is. I'm embarrassed that I don't remember, but ISTC is when you can Google. Institute, thank you so much. Institute for Scientific and Technical Communication, I think is that ISTC organization. Great. Well, thanks everybody. And thank you, Ferry. This has been great. I know a lot of us took away quite a bit from this presentation and everybody's quite appreciative. So thank you so much for taking the time to run through this. And thanks so much for the audience for staying on with us and for being so engaged and for your wonderful questions. So we hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. We will, like I said, we will be sending out a link to this recording and Ferry slides and the slides that I showed as well. So you'll all have access to those assets probably within the next day or so. So again, we thank you so much for joining. We hope you have a wonderful rest of the week and restful weekend, and hope to see you on another presentation. Thanks again, and thank you so much, Ferry, for taking the time.
Thank you, Jen, for inviting me.
Sure. Take care, everybody.
Bye.